when you talk to the Temporal guys and look at the way that they've done some of their work, is they have stuff that can run for years. So, for instance, they'll kick off a workflow for one of their customers, kicks off a workflow when the customer's created, and that workflow is like managed by Temporal for as long as that customer is a customer. So it could be, I don't know, occasionally sending out an email to, welcome, happy birthday or something, or sending them promotions or whatever. So they see workflows as like lifetime things.
Welcome to the Modern.NET Show. Formerly known as the .NET Core Podcast, we are the go-to podcast for all .NET developers worldwide, and I am your host, Jamie GaProgMan Taylor. In this episode, John Kattenhorn joined us to talk about Temporal.io and their platform for building durable workflows that can operate for years at a time. John is the CEO of Applicita and wanted to talk about the ways that developers can build applications and workflows that can live in the cloud for a very long time.
The great thing about Temporal is it manages all of those resources for you. So if you imagined me and you trying to do that, we'd end up standing up, I don't know, a running service or something that was constantly polling the data, looking for, eligible customers or something. You'd be burning some resources looking at that stuff, and that's not how they do that. So if you've got like 1 million customers there, the Temporal system dehydrates everything that isn't relevant, and only hydrates the workflows that have an action to perform.
So let's sit back, open up a terminal, type in .NET New Podcast, and we'll dive into the core of modern.NET. So, John, welcome to the show. You're a very busy chap. I'm not so busy, but not as busy. But I really appreciate whenever anyone takes the time to have a chat with me. And we're going to get into some stuff here today that I have literally no idea about. I've done some research in that, but I've never actually used this. So this will be really quite interesting. So welcome to the show.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Jamie. It's a pleasure to come and talk to you about Temporal and all things durable.
Nice. Yeah. So, we'll get on to, people have been listening so far. They've seen the name of the episode topic. So and you've just said it as well. We're going to talk about Temporal and some durable stuff.
Yep.
But I thought before we do that, would you mind giving the folks a bit of an elevator pitch, a bit of a background on John and what he does and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, no problem. Yeah. So my name's John Kattenhorn. I'm the CEO of the Applicita group. So we're a Microsoft focused tech company. We started off originally in bespoke software development, now sort of more solutions creation, hardware and software technology supply, and managed services. So it's been a wild journey. Sort of started in 2012. All kind of, like I say, Microsoft focused. We tend to, certainly on the software creation side, we're very focused on sort of .NET everywhere. So we're sort of known, I suppose, for doing interesting things with .NET, hence sort of pushing boundaries a bit and advocating for .NET, which is how we kind of got involved in Temporal, which I'm sure we'll get into.
Right. Nice. Okay, cool. So I guess we kind of need to talk about Temporal and what it is. So I know that I did a bit of looking into it, and the website is temporal.io, and I was like, I've literally never heard of this before, but what is it?
Okay, so Temporal's pretty new to .NET, so they've only recently brought out their SDK, but we started talking to Temporal about bringing kind of .NET support for their system way back in 2021, I think. It was like November 2021. What the problem that Temporal solves is around what they call durable execution. And that really means about running code to completion no matter what, transient failures or anything like that, which is often some of the issues you have in sort of distributed systems. You've got maybe third-party APIs, you've got other bits of your own system that can't always be there, or you've got a big system, you want to be able to take bits of it down, but some of it's still sort of functional. So they Temporal tend to sort of view this as like workflow. workflow and activities. So effectively what their durable execution system is doing is executing workflow. And within those workflows, you've got various activities. So, a good example of an activity might be, calling an external API, or perhaps, calling another service that you've got internally. And what it does is it's actually marshalling and managing how the workflow is working, and, restarting if there's been failures at the correct place. So fundamentally, it's kind of doing a lot of the work that you can obviously do in .NET yourself. I mean, there's some great libraries around that help with some transient failures like Poly and a few other things. But this kind of goes way beyond that. It's used, for instance, for Snapchat use it, Airbnb use it, Stripe use it. It's used a lot in finance, to sort of guarantee the completion of transactions and stuff like that. So yeah, Temporal now finally supports .NET, which is kind of what piqued our interest.
Right. Okay. So I got a couple of questions based on that. But my thinking behind it is, like you were saying, let's say I have a number of systems that are tied together. They don't have to be microservices. They could be monoliths. They could be whatever. They could be distributed monoliths, whatever. And a number of APIs that I want to call. Maybe I'm handling payment of using Stripe or something, right?
Yeah.
And in previous years, I've used something like perhaps RabbitMQ to place a job on a queue, and then a bunch of different services would maybe watch that queue and say, oh, that job's for me. Take it off the queue. I'll run the thing, and then maybe I'll crash, or maybe I'm having to be interrupted or something, and then where's that job gone, right?
Yeah.
Is that what that solves?
Yeah, it is. Yeah. So, I mean, there's a bunch of different techniques for that. I mean, I've also built that kind of outbox sort of system as well. You end up having different sort of recovery strategies, don't you? So you end up either having compensating transactions where you have to, let's say you're taking a payment for something that you then can't book. You end up having to, have another process that backs out that transaction to keep everything consistent. Temporal takes a lot of that pain. So basically you hand control of the status of where you are in that workflow to Temporal, and Temporal will manage for you how to recover. So it will know which sort of activities have completed. So did the Stripe payment go through? Did the inventory, was the inventory actually available? All that kind of stuff. And you can basically then focus on the what of the activity, not necessarily the sort of worrying about the plumbing of making sure that you can do recovery and to make sure that things are consistent. So that's really what Temporal's there to do. One of the things that's really cool about it that I found interesting in their approach was that there are some other systems around that do something similar to Temporal, but it effectively ships data to a central cloud service. And if you're in an organization that has some security concerns or is handling sensitive data, you can't really do that. You can't really use those. You can't ship off, people's account details into some unknown third-party system. Your security people won't allow that. Mm-hmm. So the way that Temporal gets around this problem is that they actually, you install the workers, as they call it, in your environment. So that could be on the cloud. If your company's got private cloud or something, it could equally be on a bunch of VMs or whatever. And then it's receiving its instructions to do things from the Temporal server itself, which is either hosted again yourself. It's entirely open source, so you could literally run the whole Temporal environment yourself if you wanted to. Or they provide a SaaS cloud environment that allows the workers to be, sort of marshaled by the cloud system. But the great thing is you're not shipping any data. At worst, you're shipping keys, sort of primary keys or external ID keys, and then even then they have a way of encrypting those so that they can't see them, and neither can anybody else that's observing the server. So they've thought hard about how to do that in a more secure environment, which I guess is another reason why it gets picked up a lot in finance and that kind of stuff.
Right. Right. I mean, that's the fact that they've thought about that is a brilliant thing, because like you're saying, right? If I've got maybe some cybersecurity folks or a security policy that says, like you say, do not send this data anywhere.
Yeah.
And I'm like, but we've architected the app so that we have to send the data somewhere.
Yeah. I mean, the thing about all of these systems, regardless of temporal, and the things that potentially are difficult, is that you need those activities just to be idempotent. So, and that can sometimes be, more difficult than you think. So, it's not anything to do with temporal. It's just about building reliable distributed systems, right? That you have to be able to architect your system in a way where you can make calls to something, more than once, and its state only changing on the first time, so there's no side effect of calling that thing, multiple times. So you have to bear that in mind in terms of like distributed systems and like building distributed systems and stuff. And there's plenty of techniques for doing that. But once you get your teams and your people's heads around how to do that, then it becomes really easy. I mean, some of the code that we've done some comparisons between code we've written ourselves to do the things that Temporal do, and then a Temporal solution, and your code base like shrinks like crazy. It's really probably, we reckon, about 35% of the code that we wrote was just like glue for making these things like act properly, and they're still probably not doing the complete job that Temporal's doing, but with none of the code, which is like super good, right?
Yeah, right. The less code that I write, it means the less code I have to look after, right?
Yeah. It's kind of like every line of code I write is an opportunity to get something wrong, right? So the less code I write, the better I look,
Absolutely, that's what we do this for, right? Yeah, and I guess because they are like the experts at writing all of this stuff that helps wire stuff together, that it's going to be battle tested, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they've. The guys that actually are behind Temporal, that founded it. If you've ever used like durable tasks in from Microsoft, or you've used Azure Event Hubs or Service Bus or any of those big services, they're the same people. So the couple of the founders, they basically were working at Microsoft. They then got lured over to Uber, which they then developed an open source platform that was sort of the precursor to Temporal, which is called Cadence. It didn't have a .NET SDK, I believe. It was like predominantly supported by Go, but I think the Go community, it was very popular in the Go community, this in Cadence, and then that spawned Temporal, which was sort of almost a sort of second Go / commercialization / let's build more sort of language support. So off the top of my head, they support not only .NET now, which is their newest one, but they've got Python, TypeScript, PHP, Go. I've probably missed a couple of others, but they've got quite a lot of other SDKs. And again, if you're in a sort of larger organization, that's pretty useful as well, because not perhaps every team is using .NET. They're using a combination of different languages, and you can all still get into the Temporal ecosystem and still be using activities and workflow. In fact, there's examples around of workflows where some of the activities are in .NET, some of the activities are in Go, and like basically Temporal will deal with all of that for you.
Right. And that makes perfect sense, right? Because like you said, if you're in a team where you're using, shall we say, the best tool for the job, and I'm very aware of the show that I produce, but .NET isn't always the best tool for the job, right? The same way that like TypeScript isn't always the best tool for the job.
Yeah,
Python
sure.
isn't always the best tool for the job, or even Go isn't the best tool for the job all the time, right? If I'm going to write, for instance, a video game that is going to target like home video game consoles,
Yeah.
all right, I may use the Godot or Godot IDE, but I may not be actually writing Go itself, right? Whereas I might want to be using Unity or Unreal or any of those big ones, and some of those have .NET stuff in them. But and if I'm doing machine learning stuff, like maybe I'm doing some actual building the machine learning stuff rather than using an API, then Python's probably the best way to go. So I really like the idea that there are multiple different language. How do I put it? So it sounds like there's an SDK for a bunch of languages, but itself is not SDK specific, right? It's like agnostic to. I said SDK, I meant languages, but you know what I mean. You know what I mean, right?
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, I mean the other couple of cool things, and it takes you a little while to get your head around this. And again, this isn't necessarily a temporal thing, although they sort of highlighted it to us, is your workflows. We as .NET developers typically think about workflows as being fairly short-lived things. It could be, to your example, it could be like a e-commerce transaction or something where you've got to do a bunch of things fairly quickly. You've got to move some inventory, you've got to take a payment credit card or whatever. When you talk to the temporal guys and look at the way that they've done some of their work, is they have stuff that can run for years. So, for instance, they'll kick off a workflow for one of their customers, kicks off a workflow when the customer's created, and that workflow is like managed by Temporal for as long as that customer is a customer. So it could be, I don't know, occasionally sending out an email to, welcome, happy birthday or something, or sending them promotions or whatever. So they see workflows as like lifetime things. And the great thing about Temporal is it manages all of those resources for you. So if you imagined me and you trying to do that, we'd end up standing up, I don't know, a running service or something that was constantly polling the data, looking for, eligible customers or something. You'd be burning some resources looking at that stuff, and that's not how they do that. So, if you've got like 1 million customers there, the temporal system dehydrates everything that isn't relevant, and only hydrates the workflows that have an action to perform. So you end up with this sort of super compressed sort of situation where you've got like really high density. You could have like millions of workflows, but they're not actually active at the moment. So they're not consuming resources, and that's quite difficult to do yourself in the .NET world. I mean, I think you already know, but we're big Orleans users, and Orleans has something in it which does something. It's in some respects a durable execution framework or platform rather than a framework. It just doesn't have any of the semantics of Temporal, but you could definitely build a Temporal like system on top of Orleans if you wanted to. And that also has a way of expiring kind of grains, as they call them, which are effectively actors, and put them to sleep until they're needed. So when you start to get some of that capability together, you can build some things in some really interesting ways that wouldn't always be like options you would choose, but you're like, oh wow, okay, that means I could do this thing, So workflows can be minutes, seconds, weeks, months, years long. The Temporal doesn't care.
Right. Okay. So like a question that I just sort of had whilst you were talking about the long-lived nature, I suppose, of workflows is that like, and it's going to be hyperbolic, and it is going to be a bit of a leading question, I suppose, but like, why do I need this if I've got Hangfire? Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, apart from the semantics of having to write a really good Hangfire job that's executing, the fact that you've got something that's kind of like constantly polling, constantly making an assessment for work to do, that's sort of taking resources, right? It's kind of like, even if that job's like super efficient, it's having to make, do I need to do any work kind of thing, decisions, where Temporal's kind of like inside out. It's kind of like it only is executing things it knows has work to do. So you don't have to have consuming any resources that might be, I don't know, trawling a database table or looking at a queue or something else, looking for work. That basically the way it works, I think, is it keeps like the metadata kind of
contained within its system, so it kind of knows when it needs to wake up workflows or activities, and then kind of like does some work against them. I think they've just introduced an equivalent, I suppose, of Hangfire, which is, what they use, I think they call cron jobs, which is being able to do, instead of like event-driven triggers for execution, it's basically time-based, so you can say like, every 60 minutes, go do this, kick off this workflow or kick off this activity. But they're predominantly looking at doing things through eventing, so it's kind of like, has this customer event occurred? Yes. Okay. Right. Now I need to go and do this other thing in an activity, so there's a subtle difference there, but it's really important when you get to big scale.
Sure. And that makes sense, right? That's why I asked that question.
Yeah,
it's like somebody out there will be thinking, what is the difference? And there is a difference, and it's initially a subtle difference, but it will make a big difference when you're designing and architecting your apps, right?
Yeah. I mean, Temporal, if you wanted like a good analogy, and a saga pattern is probably a really sort of close kindred spirit of Temporal, so like, if you've I'm trying to think of a good .NET one now, but there's a couple of good .NET implementations around of like the saga pattern, which is doing kind of orchestration and understanding where it is in that orchestrative pattern, and managing all of that. Temporal is very similar to that, albeit it's kind of out of process, not in process. So if you're doing some sort of saga, again, you can do saga pattern with all lanes. We've done that a lot. So there's definitely some overlap. I mean, there's one of the other couple of things I haven't mentioned up to now is actually the post go live, right? So you've probably built systems like this as well, where if you're in a distributed system, something's gone wrong, you've had a customer complaint where they received it's been delivered email, but nothing's been delivered or something. And you're like, right, okay, well, what's happened then? Because you've had all of these sort of isolated activities or steps that have sort of had to happen. But unless you've been really cute with kind of like observations and using spans and stuff like that, you're into like a really deep investigation inside logs, trying to piece together the timeline of okay, well, I can see this activity happened at like 11:12 and 300 milliseconds, and this one's happened at, and you've probably sat there before, like me, kind of like scribbling that stuff down, trying to figure out, which order these things happened. Oh no, that one threw an exception, but what time was that? And was that UTC? Was that like local time? So quite difficult sometimes to debug that distributed stuff. Whereas Temporal actually gives you this really nice UI, basically. I mean, you can look at it in the UI, but you can actually also pull it as logs, and it will basically run you through, all the retries, all of the sequencing, all of the success, all the returns. You can actually get it actually shows you snapshots of the inputs and the outputs to activities. So in the context of an API, that would be, well, here were all the inputs that went into that API. This was the return codes that we got from the API. And you can do this really nice sort of investigation. But not only that, so if that shows you a problem, like a transient problem, say in production, but you're like, okay, well, we can't reproduce this in test, you can actually ask Temporal to give you a copy of that activity journal, I suppose, for want of a better word. And then you can go and take it to your local dev environment or some other environment and replay it, and ask Temporal to replay it while you've got the debugger attached to it, basically, which is like super, super cool. So you can take a real world sort of production, weird edge casey kind of, workflow type issue, and then go replay it as many times as you like in your dev environment without having to, piece together all that test data and try and recreate all of those results. And when I saw that, I was like, it just brings back so many memories of working very late at night, trying to figure out, why some of these sort of really subtle things were happening. And you're like, I can just go back to my workstation and like play it over and over and over again with the debugger attached, and figure out what's gone wrong, which is pretty awesome. I've not seen that anywhere else, and that really really turns on to Temporal.
Right, yeah, because that was always one of the big things when I've worked with microservices. Like you said, it's like,
Yeah.
let's say you have a chain of say six different. I mean, they don't have to be microservices, but
No.
six different services that need to take place. We talked briefly about perhaps an e-commerce system, right? So a customer interacts with a user interface to buy a thing, right? Let's say it's an Amazon or whatever, right? They go to my website.sale or whatever and say, I want to buy this thing, right? When they complete that transaction, there's actually a bunch of things that need to happen, and they can happen asynchronously, but we tend to, if you're coming directly from an ASP.NET Core MVC Razor Pages sort of thing, we especially if it's a monolithic app, we tend to do them synchronously, right? So it's like go to do something in stores to actually put that inventory to one side, then go process the payment. When the payment processing comes back, which will be, each of these will be asynchronous, but we're doing them almost synchronously, one after the other, and then it'll be like, right, okay, send a message to the picking team, so they'll go out and pick the inventory off the shelf, and then go get the data from the client database or the customer database, sorry, that gets the information on where to send it to and things like that. And then there's this whole process involved in actually going from user has clicked buy now all the way through to putting it on the lorry and it being delivered at their house. Whereas, like you're saying, splitting those up into services where you can, in my past, it's been putting a job on a queue and everybody looks at the queue and pulls the correct job to run and then puts maybe a different job on the queue. But it sounds like in the past when I've done that, like you were saying, like debugging that entire journey is horrendous if you split up into small services, because then you're like, well, where did it get to? Like, was it running these services in parallel? Was it running them in serial or one after the other? And where did it break? And how do we get to that point, fix that, and then send it back through, right? Do we have to start back at the beginning, or can we just send it back to that one step that fell over and carry on from there? So
you end up writing something to hack it back together, don't you?
Yeah. So being able to debug that process is like a godsend.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's sort of two shifts that I suppose. Let's just stick with the e-commerce system. And the first shift is making it asynchronous at all, right? Because perhaps developers maybe earlier in their careers, it's quite nervous to say, you're effectively saying accept the order, not process the order. So you're basically returning the control back to the user and saying, hey, we've got your job, we're doing it. And Temporal allows you to have both scenarios, so you can basically like execute a workflow and then wait for that workflow to finish. But obviously most e-commerce being a good one, you want to execute the workflow but just immediately return back to and then let the effects of the activities sort of drive the flow. So I guess in the e-commerce world, like you said, you'd be off to do the picking, you'd be off to do the send the email for confirmation, then you would like kick off the billing and and sort of do all of that stuff whilst the customer has not gone on with their day. Basically, they're sort of assumed that everything's all fine and dandy, and then you need quite sophisticated systems to make sure that that's the truth. Right? So even if there is a failure or there is a transient or not, or, oh, by the way, you've sold something that, because of our eventually consistent logistics system, we don't actually have at the moment. So this won't be here now until Thursday instead of, ship next day. Who do we tell? So all of that kind of intricate flow when you disconnect things needs to be managed by code, right? And things like Temporal, Orleans, there's lots of other different systems that can do that, but like Temporal makes that much easier because you can just focus on the code, the implementation for each of those activities, and then sort of put them in a workflow. And then the workflow chain itself is sort of almost self-documenting, and then you can kind of like, once you've tested those workflows, you just know that somehow this job is going to get to completion. As long as you've got activities for each one of the sort of situations, it's just going to work. The customer might receive an email that says, hey, look, this is going to be a couple of days longer, or by the way, we need you to give us different credit card details because we've tried those and they don't work or something anymore. We did like pre-validation, and for some reason post-validation they don't work anymore or something. But I think they'd rather receive that than waiting, for the transaction to happen in real time, and then if it doesn't, or times out or crashes or whatever, then it's a bad experience, But it puts all the complexity back in mine and your lap, right, as software developers.
Do you have a WPF application and want to take it to macOS or Linux? Avalonia XPF, a binary-compatible cross-platform fork of WPF, enables WPF apps to run on new platforms with minimal effort and maximum compatibility. With a few tweaks to your project file, your WPF app and all of its dependencies are ready for testing on new platforms. Start your app transformation journey with a 30-day free trial. Head over to avaloniaui.net/themodern.net show to get started today, or press the link in the show notes as it will have the full URL. HTTP timeouts, database deadlocks. In software, it's not a matter of if things fail, it's a matter of when. One mishap like this, and some valuable data is lost forever. And these failures occur all the time. But it doesn't have to be this way. Introducing NServiceBus, the ultimate tool to build robust and reliable systems that can handle features gracefully, maintain high availability, and scale to meet growing demand. For more than 15 years, NServiceBus has been trusted to run mission-critical systems that must not go down or lose any data, ever. And now you could try it for yourself. NServiceBus integrates seamlessly with your .NET applications and can be hosted on-premises or in the cloud. Say goodbye to lost data and system failures, and say hello to a better, more reliable way of building distributed systems. Try using NServiceBus today by heading over to go.particular.net/themodern.net show and start building better systems with asynchronous messaging using NServiceBus. There'll be a full link in the show notes, so give that a click.
Yeah, well, I guess it takes the complexity of, like you said, wiring it all up and figuring out how do we go from A to B to C to D. We're just focusing on A, B, C, and D, right? Yeah. Yeah, exactly that. Yeah. You kind of don't have to hold the entire mental model like in your head at any one time. And what we do with stuff that's non-trivial is we actually produce swim lane diagrams. The ones with like sort of where you have like columns and then you've got like flowchart objects typically, and we'll have a swim lane per external service or external component or whatever. And then we sit there and we draw it out. So we, have activities as a certain shape, and we have like workflow as a different shape. And then, and then we sort of do all of that planning up front so that we have a good idea of the structure of the workflows and the structure of the activities and who's got to do what. You don't necessarily need to know exactly what the code implementation is going to be. That helps a lot, I think, with figuring out the elegance of the workflows and the, you don't suddenly, have somebody say, oh yeah, but what about this scenario? What about this scenario? I mean, it still happens occasionally, but you've done a lot more planning up front. Right. And like you say, you're able to then concentrate on the important bits that we have to, okay, so I'm going to go on a bit of a rant, and it's got nothing to do with Temporal, right? But I feel like I need to get those off my chest, right? The DevOps movement is fantastic and it's great, but the problem that I feel it has caused is it's become developers focusing on infrastructure and on how all that works and how it's all glued together and how the process works, whereas actually, realistically, when you boil everything out, dial everything down, your metaphor the way out of it, you actually find that we should be writing the code which produces the results that the business wants. Yes, we should probably have our finger on the pulse of how it's going to get developed and deployed and how it's going to live in the world. But realistically, we are hired
we're hired to do a whole bunch of stuff, but one of the things we're hired to do is to turn that human language business logic into computer language business logic. And I like the idea that Temporal, from the sounds of it, allows me to not worry about how these things are connected together and how we communicate across them. I can just say, hey, I have service. It could be micro, it could be monolith, it could be whatever. A over here, service B over there, and service C over there. When app talks to service A, somehow we need to get a message to both B and C, and both of those need to send a message back to app somehow. I don't care how.
Yeah.
I will tell you what A, B, and C need to do because I will give you the code for them, and I will tell you what app needs to do because I'll give you the code for them. But I need you to figure out how to glue it all together.
Yeah.
Sounds like that's the case. Is that the case?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, you have these things called queries and signals in Temporal, which allow workflow to, tell the world, where they are, what they're doing and stuff like that. So you can obviously listen for signals, which are like raising events basically. And you could also query a workflow as well. So, if you want to build a UI or, for example, with our e-commerce example where we'd be like, hey, I'd like to know where is my order or whatever, you could, put a page together that's sort of called this workflow query and it will tell you which activity it's currently like working on. So you've got that sort of visibility. But going back to your DevOps point, which is one of those things that I think got widely misunderstood, really. And we at Applicita, we have all we ask of our developers really is to have an appreciation of the infrastructure and sort of particularly take responsibility for what's coming out from an observability point of view out of the software they've written. We still, it's not a silo because people think, silos is a negative thing, but it's more a case of, these people over here have a really deep knowledge of, rolling out Azure this and Azure that. These guys over here have a really deep knowledge of like .NET. They have an appreciation of what each one of those people do, and they'll sit in a huddle if they need to and kind of like figure stuff out. But like you say, this movement to a few years ago is kind of like implying that, .NET developers suddenly had to be, experts in like all, how many is there? Would you think 500 services in Azure, maybe 350 or something? As well as being good .NET developers, as well as being good, business analysts and stuff. I think, you've hit the nail on the head, really. We're, as developers, responsible really for the validity and the quality of the code that we produce. So I'd much rather developers were sort of focused on, the correctness of what they were doing than worrying about, some bit of tin somewhere sitting in, sort of some data center in Azure. I just don't think that's. I'm sure it wasn't intended that way, but that's how it got interpreted by a few people, right? Do you agree?
I agree completely. Yeah. I think that, in my opinion, DevOps itself is more of a what is it? It's not like a community. It's like a mindset, right? Yeah. You want it to be building the solution, not just the apps, but the entire solution, how the infrastructure is held together and how it's deployed and things like that. You want to build the solution with the mindset of everyone needs to sort of like work together as a in a specific way to make that happen.
Yeah, it's an attitude, isn't it? Really,
yeah, that's it, right? And DevOps itself, from my perspective, isn't a role itself, right? And it isn't a responsibility that a person has. You'll have infrastructure people, you'll have developers, you'll have operations. When you throw other words in like DevSecOps, and that becomes about development, security, and operations, it's not that the developers themselves have to deal with the security. It's that security is involved from day one.
Yeah, exactly that.
That's what that's all about.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. I mean, you've probably, I've been doing this a long time, unfortunately, now, unfortunately, depending on the point of view. And I've worked in organisations where developers would put software on the end of the shovel and like ping it over the fence, and then infrastructure people would like ping it back at them and say it doesn't work. And there was like neither of those two groups much liked each other or saw each other's point of views, and it just ended up with a lot of political time wasting going on and that. So I guess the movement was trying to say, hey, look, you guys have all got skills, or girls, have all got skills. Let's all work together towards the common goal, which is, to your point, shipping a working solution, right? So, like you say, it's a mindset. I mean, it does drive you bonkers though, because try advertising for a job role now for somebody that's in infrastructure where you don't use the word DevOps. Like, nobody applies for it, because they don't know what it is. So you have to use the word in order to get people to, oh, right, okay, it means this, So, okay, if you like, But yeah, so it does irk me a little bit that I have to throw the word around, but like you say, it's a culture, not a skill,
Yeah, 100%. So then I guess sticking with that DevOps idea, right? Somebody may be listening to this and going, but Kubernetes lets me do durable things, right? In that, like, I could put all my code in pods, and if a pod dies, it'll start it back up.
Yeah.
But that's different to Temporal, right? Because my understanding is, if I have a service that is being hosted by Temporal and that service goes down, the work that it was doing can still be sort of rescued. Is that right? Whereas with Kubernetes, if I have some code in a pod and it's processing something, and then the pod goes down and is replaced by a different pod, then that processing is gone, right? All that data is gone.
That's right. You've lost that state.
Am I on the right lines?
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, I mean, we actually use the Temporal workers. We should probably roll back a little bit. So the way that the .NET implementation of the Temporal works is really nice, right? So if you've ever used ASP.NET, like Service Host or whatever the non-ASP.NET version of that is, you normally get a nice knot of extensions that say, add tracing or add Swagger or whatever. You literally can say like add Temporal worker, and then you tell it where the server is, and then you can start registering workflows. So you can say like add workflows. You don't have to do them sort of compile time. You can do them at runtime too. So literally to get Temporal up and running in .NET is like super simple. And what's happening behind the scenes, I believe, is that it's firing up. Do you remember the background service sort of functionality they brought into .NET Core? It's firing that up, and it's basically bringing up the worker role. So it's, and then registering with the server to say, hey, I'm ready to do work and all that kind of stuff. So if you then zoom out a little bit and think about, okay, so my .NET code running in my pod, you're in a Temporal world, you've got your .NET code, which is running also this background service, which has got the worker role in it. And then that's executing the activities that are handed to it by the server. So let's say your Kubernetes server, decides this pod needs to be evicted for some reason, or like say crashes or whatever. What happens is that obviously that pod dies, new pod comes back online, brings up the .NET code, just your regular exe or whatever. That starts up the worker again. The worker then like re-registers with this thing and says, hey, I'm ready to do work. And the server will say, well, okay, I've lost this other one, and it was in the middle of doing this, and we saved this state halfway through this activity or whatever, and then it will just give that with the right, if that's the most important thing to do next, because there's a whole bunch of policy stuff and priorities I won't go into right now, but let's assume that for now there's nothing else to do. It will just basically pass it that job and say, here's where you got to, here's the state that you were in, off you go, and it will just pick up where it left off, kind of thing. So it's actually doing two things. It's not just running, it's not marshalling the running of code, it's also saving state. I've seen people build a fairly rudimentary sort of whole actor system just in Temporal, because you could literally actually the way that it follows the same rules actually as JSON, the new system.json namespace. So if you could serialize the object, you don't even have to, you could just have like objects in your executable code and never have to save them and never have to persist them anywhere, because Temporal does it for you. So you could just basically like live off of local variables if you wanted to. and it sort of basically will dehydrate anything that's running in that, or the values of any of those things in the activity, and then rehydrate them again when it's needed, if it's died or because that activity needs to run again or whatever. And it handles all of that. So you sort of get this state persistence as well as sort of Temporal's workflow marshalling, I guess you'd call it, which is pretty neat.
No, I like that because, like you said, I want to be able to persist something as I move from state to state, because otherwise I've got no idea what happened, right? And we're back at that position we talked about earlier on, where you're sitting there at 2:00 in the morning and you're reading 5 different logs from 5 different services, trying to figure out where did my processing get to. And let's not talk about how people don't log enough when they're making their services.
You're staring into the darkness. Yeah.
Okay. So so we've talked about how there's an SDK for it for .NET. Like, how do I get started? Is it just like pull in a NuGet package, add a line or two to maybe my app services .json or app settings, .json, and away we go?
Yeah, it is. It is a sort of, like with all of these things, it's sort of graduated levels of customization, in terms of like, if you're pointing at different bits of the server or whatever, but it's got some really nice opinionated defaults. So, you can just get yourself going really quickly, like exactly to your point, pull the .NET, the NuGet package, probably add 3 or 4 lines depending on what you're doing with workflows and stuff, and then it's good to go. Press F5, off it goes, and then you could jump into the UI. I mean, there's a couple of different ways where you can set your own development environment up in for the Temporal server itself. My favorite is to use Docker Compose. So I use, Docker Desktop, and then use Docker Compose to bring up the Temporal server. But you don't have to do it that way. You could either have a local install in your dev environment somewhere if you're sharing with, other developers, or I believe you can actually run it even from the command line. So you can, they give you a sort of cut down version of, a bit like the .NET CLI kind of command line, they have like an equivalent Temporal one, and you can do, Temporal server start or something. It's just my preference is to do it through Docker, but, and then you can immediately, so your code is up, you can immediately go into the UI and it will show you the health of the worker and stuff. So you'll know straight away that the worker's up. So you don't even really need to register any like workflow or activities. You could just get yourself going with like 2 or 3 lines of code, point it at your local Docker environment or your local install, and then you're up and running.
Right. Okay. And I guess I would need to do that on each of my things which need to live inside of a worker, right?
Yeah. If you, I mean, you don't have to be like one for one. In fact, the talk I did with Temporal, I sort of misdrew a diagram, which I didn't realize that the diagram was wrong actually until I actually did this sort of presentation. So I sort of implied that there was like a worker per instance. So like, let's say you had an e-commerce system and it was behind a load balancer, and you've got, I don't know, 3 instances of that, or 3 pods, say, running in. You don't need to have 3 workers. You could, like, if you wanted the same code to just be running on every one of those pods. But an equally valid way would be to leave the e-commerce system exactly as it was, and then build another little tiny piece of .NET that did nothing else other than start the worker process, and then deploy that to a pod, so that you had these kind of like 3 e-commerce systems all referring to, with their Temporal clients, all referring to, a single Temporal worker. They're incredibly efficient, and they obviously, depending on the length of your activities and the length of they can process, phenomenal amounts of instructions and stuff. So yeah, you don't have to do as my, don't you hate that when you realize like I'd spent this ages on this presentation. It was only actually while I was presenting, I was like, this diagram is wrong. But yeah, you don't need to have an instance per thing if you don't want to. I would probably steer away from that. Actually, I'd probably put it in a separate place to start with, and then get comfortable with load and understanding. How many of these workers do you need to for your workload, and then go from there.
Right. Okay. Because I can imagine that there is a fundamental difference in how you're going to architect your application and services and stuff. And so, I guess not starting with temporal all the things.
Yeah.
That might be the best way to do it, right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I mean, it definitely. The thing about understanding temporal as well is it opens up options that you, as an architect, it changes your cost value calculation a little bit, as an architect, I guess, or as a really senior developer, is you might want to put some of this kind of extra resilience into the system, but the cost of doing it is too high. So you end up with known frigidity in your system, and it's, a reasonable payoff because, that you can't afford the cost of, securing that particular transaction or whatever. If you bring temporal to the story, then those dynamics change completely. So you can afford to make everything super robust, super, they call it indestructible kind of, because the cost to do so is so low. You might as well do it all, which just generally means that you end up with a, super robust system, because no matter what smart decisions you made as an architect on a sort of ROI basis, that one thing you left as a thing that's hey, it's very unlikely that's going to happen. We can't afford the time or the money to sort of shore that one up. That will bite you on Friday afternoon at some point about 4:00, it does change the fundamental value decision making that you need to make when you're building some of this stuff. And it's pretty easy to retrofit as well. If you've got we've looked at some code bases that aren't temporal, and we write pretty clean code. So we do a lot of for instance mediator. So if you're if you have commands and command handlers, and you've got some reasonable level of separation of concerns in your code, it's really easy to temporalize it, if that's a word. You can kind of create a new class if you want, or put in a new method, and it's literally like an attribute. So if you've got reasonable amounts of separation, you could just okay, well, what we're going to do is we're going to leave the current code as is. We'll take a copy of it, we'll put it in this new class with this new method, and then we'll put the correct sort of attributes on it to decorate it, and then we'll have some feature switches or something that could switch between how we used to do it and how we're doing it now with temporal. And if you've got a big ball of mud, that's obviously going to be a little bit more difficult, but that's true of any refactoring, right? But yeah, we've definitely looked at some stuff we've built for clients and said, hey, the next time you want us to do some versioning, we've got this idea where we can do a big improvement, but we can move this code from here to, and what we did, which was sort of our poor man's version of temporal, to temporal, in a really easy way, and then they just get a much more robust system almost for free.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's the thing that, like I said, it's important to sort of point out that you really do kind of need to rethink everything. But like you said, it gives you the different things you can add to this particular solution that you can't really add to others. I like that. I think that. So if I'm gonna, you mentioned a few times that they have their own hosting platform that I can host my apps in.
Yeah.
If I use Temporal, do I have to use that, or can I go, hey, I want to host it on Azure or AWS or things like that? Am I tied into their service?
Yeah, sure. Okay, then. So yeah, the only the cloud bit that they have provides is just the temporal server. So you don't have to, move your workloads or, move your apps or anything like that. It's literally the the backplane, if you like, of Temporal. They have a SaaS service which is automatically scales and super secure and all of those good things that you'd expect from a SaaS platform. But you absolutely don't have to do that. You can run the whole Temporal server yourself. From Docker containers, for instance. So you could put it wherever you like. AKS, EKS. VMs, whatever. You can even not run it in containers, I believe. I think you can literally, download there's a lot to it. So certainly in the guidance we've been given, unless you're really proficient at like Progress, and Elasticsearch and, one or two other tools, don't run it in production unless you really know what you're doing, because it is the single point of failure. So if your Temporal server was to go offline or be broken or not be performant, then you're going to break the performance of the whole thing, because the workers won't get won't get told what to do. They won't be able to reliably send their updates, all that kind of stuff. So I'd probably advise if you looked at the stack and said, we've got deep skills in all of these things, don't worry, then great. But if you didn't, I would go with the Temporal Cloud thing, because it's super cheap.
You mentioned there about if the Temporal service falls over, then you need something else. Then that's your single point of failure. So clearly we need Temporal for Temporal, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the workers themselves will carry on, doing the work that they're doing, but of course they can't phone home, so they can't say that hey, this activity's finished and stuff. So if you were then to get a sort of cascading of failure, I don't know, I mean, it's going to be pretty rare, but if you had like a Temporal server that was offline or broken, and then you had a worker that was offline, went offline after doing some new activity, then you're going to lose where it was, because it will bring itself back online and it will obviously have all of its state that it had, and will try and recover itself. But it didn't get that information back to the server, so it can't say to the server, hey, what's next for me, kind of thing, So you don't get like data loss or anything like that, but it gets kind of stuck because of the orchestration of that workflow and stuff is being done by that centralized environment, which is why Temporal themselves like people to use the Temporal cloud system, because it's like uber resilient. And I believe it's all hosted in AWS, and they've got a global environment where Europe and the US and lots of other places where they've got the Temporal backplane available, so it doesn't suffer with any even data center related failures. It's pretty neat.
Right, that's pretty cool. Okay, so what about examples and say killer apps that have used Temporal? Right, I know that they make a big deal on their website of saying, "Hey, these people use our stuff."
Yeah,
but I was wondering, do you know of any examples where I know that finding open source examples that use it might not be too easy to do, but like, do you know of any examples where people can just like take a look and go, oh, cool, I get it now. That's why you did it that way or whatever.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, this is where because the .NET SDK is like new, and by new I mean I think the official GA. I mean, we started working on it about 12 months ago, I think, 18 months ago maybe, but it only GA'd like a month ago, I think, 6 weeks ago maybe. The documentation, they're still catching up, and there are a lot of, I wouldn't call them hello world examples, but if you go to the GitHub sample, there's a sample for every feature of Temporal, written in .NET. There's a really great guy over there who did the .NET SDK, and he's put a lot of effort into showing how to use each one of the activities. But the thing that's missing at the moment, and the thing that we're like working with them is how do you put all these things together in a best practice way to sort of show, to show how to use it all in context, and that's definitely missing. Where we're using it, we can't share that code because it's like a client project. So we're talking to Temporal about maybe taking like eShop or, some of the sort of more famous known sort of exemplars, I suppose you call them, and then kind of, take a fork of one of those and then temporalize it and then give it back to the community for free and say, this is how, an end-to-end application would look like using, they do have end-to-end examples, just to be clear, in lots of the other languages. So if you did know Go or TypeScript, or they're the two I focused on, then you could go and look at those and then do the sort of translation in your head and say, right, okay, I know what the equivalent of the .NET version of this would be. But we really want to work with them to, get a bona fide eShop like thing that, everybody knows and loves, and go, right, okay, I see what you've done here. It's like, looks like this in .NET, and that's kind of what's missing at the moment. So yeah, it's early for sure.
Right. Okay. That's pretty cool that there's some samples that kind of lay out some of the features already. Because I can imagine that so we're recording this Feb 7th, right? So if the SDK is really only a month or so old, then I can imagine we're still in that ramping up stage of how do we, what documentation do we need? What examples do we need? And I like the idea that you're saying about taking some of the .NET stuff from the .NET team, like the eShop and containers and stuff, and perhaps putting Temporal behind it, just as an example. Hey, this is a well-known example that you can see how it would fit in this area. That's pretty cool. So,
definitely.
So what about? I'm conscious that we don't want to just be reading URLs, right? I say this to everyone all the time. I don't want, but I'll get some URLs off of you afterwards, and I'll put them in the show notes. So folks who are listening in, make sure you press whatever to the full version of the show notes. There'll be a bigger list of links to check out. But where are some of the places that folks can go to learn about Temporal? I know obviously there'll be the website. You've mentioned the samples repo. You've also mentioned a couple of times you've given a talk on these things. Are these easy to find on the web?
So the talk wasn't recorded, unfortunately, but the deck is currently being published. So and it's a Temporal / Orleans kind of talk that I did. So I'm just talking to the Temporal guys now about doing a Temporal only thing, although I make it very clear in the talk that you don't need Orleans to use Temporal and you don't need Temporal to use Orleans. It was just like a sort of, if you wanted to build a really high performance workflow system, this is one way of doing it. But places to go where I found useful, definitely Temporal's YouTube channel, both their own channel, and if you just type in Temporal.io as well, you'll find other people that have done some talks. But Temporal have been really good right from the outset. So if you're looking for primers on Temporal, done a better job of explaining the principles of Temporal than I have today. Definitely go to YouTube. You can see some great 101 stuff from them and 102 stuff from them about that. There's actually a video from Chad, who's the guy who did the .NET SDK, where he talks towards the back of the video about using the SDK, but quite a lot of the video is about how he came to create it, how he came to create the .NET SDK and what that took, because it was non-trivial, as you can imagine. Samples in GitHub. The trick I use, and there's a few around now, is if you go find the activity attribute, which I think is as simple as square bracket activity something close bracket, or look for the namespace. I actually search through GitHub looking for the Temporal namespace declaration, and you can, it pulls up what people are doing, and certainly over .NET there's a lot more people doing some non-trivial stuff now. There's some people experimenting, you can see, with logistics flows and stuff. I see which is one of the key places where I sort of see it really shining, where people have got long supply chains and they're figuring that stuff out. The README is really good because Chad knew that it was going to take a while to get the documentation parallel with what's already there. So the actual README in the .NET SDK is awesome. He spent ages on it. If you got stuck with a Pacific, with a Pacific thing, or you just, needed some more input, then obviously you could reach out to me too. And I could put you on touch with, one of our team members or look at it myself, whatever. So yeah, it's like I say, early, but there's, quite a bit around, and they've got a really good Slack, sort of ecosystem as well. So like the whole company, Temporal company, is on Slack, and they invite like the public basically into the same Slack channel. So there's one there for the .NET SDK, and I've really seen over the last sort of 2 or 3 weeks the traffic increasing in that. Lots of questions, lots of people trying things out, and there's a couple of us, people that don't work for Temporal that are in there kind of answering questions, and then Chad's in there all the time as well. So there's a plenty of what's the word I'm looking for? Non-formal kind of support out there now, and it's very quickly going to become formal as they bring it on par with TypeScript and Go and some of the other languages.
I really like that there's this community aspect to it where you can just jump in and ask a question. That's always really useful, especially if you're like, if you are let's say doesn't matter which language or framework you use, right? But if you're a developer and you're like, I want to check out this thing, but it means I need to fundamentally rewrite the way I've written my apps. I'm going to want to reach out to some folks to get help first to make sure I understand how I'm doing it, right? Yeah. So I fully appreciate that that's there. That's pretty cool. So then just as we wrap up then, what about getting into contact with you, right? If someone's listening to this and gone, I've got this burning question to ask John, and maybe he can, like you said, maybe he can put me in the right direction of the person to talk to or whatever. How does someone go about getting in contact with you? Is it Twitter/X? Is it LinkedIn? Is it, what's that process look like?
So I have a really unusual surname, which is Kattenhorn. So I'm dead easy to find. So, but yeah, if you look for me, like John_Kattenhorn on X/Twitter, you can find me there. You can also find me on LinkedIn, same name. And really welcome feedback. Love listening to people's challenges and if they're doing cool things with Temporal or want some help with some questions, and I'm always into that.
Nice. Okay, cool. Well, like I said earlier, I'm going to make all of the links and things available in the show notes. So if you do want to click through and find out more about Temporal or get in touch with John, then that will all be there. And I guess that really all that's left to say is thank you very much, John, for being on the show. I know that I've learned a whole bunch of stuff. I always say this, right? But I genuinely mean it, right? I came into this episode with I know that temporal.io is the URL, and I know that Temporal is a thing. Teach me, right? But I've walked away from this with right, okay, I gotta go build something that I can maybe put in Temporal and get my head around a durable workflow design, because I'm pretty sure that there's a project I'm working on that should be using a workflow like design.
Yeah. It's well, thanks a lot for having me, Jamie. It's been great to talk about Temporal. Yeah, I think probably if we all looked at various different things we've built, especially if you knew Temporal, you just could put it into pretty much any sort of even small apps, and you get a big benefit from it. It isn't just like a full blown enterprise thing. It's a little bit of a learning curve to it, but once you get your head around the learning curve, just like with anything, then you'd be like, oh yeah, okay, we need to send an email out and make sure that it does really go out. Okay, let's do this. It's pretty cool, and you're going to see the Temporal guys bringing out some even more interesting stuff over the next sort of 6 to 9 months, they treat the sort of .NET SDK now is like what they call first class citizens. So it's kind of always going to be parallel with all of the other stuff. So although it came late, it won't lag behind. It will now be kind of on par with everything else.
Right. Awesome. Well, like I said, John, thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to playing around with Temporal to see what I can build. So yeah, I really appreciate it. Thank you.
No problem. You're welcome. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Modern.NET Show with me, Jamie Taylor. I'd like to thank this episode's guest, John Kattenhorn, for graciously sharing his time, expertise, and knowledge. Be sure to check out the show notes for a bunch of links to some of the stuff that we covered and a full transcription of the interview. The show notes, as always, can be found at the show's website, and there will be a link directly to them in your podcatcher. And don't forget to spread the word. Leave a rating or review on your podcatcher of choice. Head over to .NETCore.show/review for ways to do that. Reach out via our contact page at .NETCore.show/contact, or join our Discord server at .NETCore.show/discord, all of which are linked in the show notes. But above all, I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day, and I hope that I'll see you again next time for more .NET goodness. I'll see you again real soon. See you later, folks.